October 3rd, the day the laughter stopped. When the sun rose October 3rd, Friday, President Lincoln strode out to review soldiers around the Antietam battle site, having nearly ascertained what he wanted most. He seemed to want to know the exact size and condition of the army to buttress his exhortations to General McClellan that McClellan should really be doing something, such as taking the battle of General Lee's recuperating troops across the river before they got off scot-free and continued to wage war. The news of Lincoln's secret, unannounced visit was already being carried to Lee by Eros von Bork of Jeb Stuart's staff, who left the Grove Farm just a few short hours before Lincoln arrived there. General Lee had ordered von Bork to, as a pretext, take papers to McClellan and negotiate the exchange of prisoners just captured 2 days earlier by Stuart's cavalry from a battle southwest of Shepherdstown. His real mission, von Bork later wrote, was to employ all my diplomacy to obtain a large insight into McClellan's positions, which he did. Von Bork, a man of big appetites, noted the sumptuous feast being readied in the front yard of the Grove Farm and was shooed away back to Virginia even as Federals were aiming spyglasses from a moored high hot air balloon in the direction of Harper's Ferry, Lincoln's previous visit. Confederate Colonel Edwin Gray Lee, one of those captured by the 8th Illinois raid into Shepherdstown on September 25th, also brought the news of Lincoln's visit to his mother, Henrietta Bettinger Lee, at Bedford outside Shepherdstown. While held prisoner, Lee dined attentively with George Armstrong Custer and other officers who were all encamped at the same Grove Farm. Von Bork would report to Generals Lee and Jackson that the Federal Army soldiers were well dressed and had the look of being well fed, their arms were in excellent condition, and the whole of their cantonments spoke of a high degree of military discipline. He would note to himself, the absence of which I had so often regretted in our own bivouacs. After hearing von Bork's report in his tent at Bunker Hill early on the morning of October 3rd, as Lincoln was also rising with Ozias Hatch to bed-check Federal troops near the Grove Farm, General Lee must have concluded that a Lincoln visit presaged imminent movement by the large, rested and prepared Federal Army. To confound any such advance and perhaps to yet have a pro-Confederate impact on the outcome of a rapidly approaching congressional election for the North, Lee issued orders to General Stuart to lead 1,800 cavalrymen on a dangerous, defiant mission to ride and loot entirely around McClellan's army, terrorizing the populace throughout Pennsylvania and Maryland. And that Stuart did, with elan, from Thursday, October 9th, until they returned Sunday, October 12th. But, as it was on the morning of October 3rd, Lincoln was reviewing men of the Ninth Corps under General Ambrose Burnside in the area near the Antietam Bridge, the one that Burnside's men had finally taken in the final climactic hours of the Antietam battle on September 17th. Lincoln was still keeping the staff in stitches with stories that morning, delaying the review by 2 hours, wrote General Jacob Cox. We were ordered to be under arms by 8 o'clock, but it was more than 2 hours after that. The officers were very hilarious over some grotesque story which Mr. Lincoln had seasoned the conversations. The usual march in review was omitted for lack of time, the president contenting himself with riding along the lines formed in parade. Then it was onward in the ambulance train to the heart of the fiercest fighting at the cornfield and along Hagerstown Pike, where Generals Hooker and Sumner's men saw the elephant, a soldier's term for seeing en face war's horrors. Cox continued, I was with the party of officers invited by McClellan to accompany the president in a ride over the route which Sumner had followed in battle. We crossed the Antietam in front of Keedysville, followed the hollows and byways to the East Wood, and passed through this and the cornfields, which had been the scene of Hooker's and Mansfield's fierce fighting. Awaiting Lincoln along the Hagerstown Pike were cavalry units, including the 8th Illinois Cavalry, the unit of Abner Hard. All the troops were ordered out to be reviewed by President Lincoln and General McClellan. The ground chosen was that part of the battlefield where Generals Hooker and Sumner had fought. Our brigade was drawn up in line near the Hagerstown Turnpike, surrounded on all sides by numberless graves filled with the dead of the recent battles. After standing 2 or 3 hours, the review commenced. The president appeared dressed in citizen's clothes, wearing a high-crowned hat, his long, lean figure contrasting strangely with the compact form of General McClellan. As they approached, the battery belched forth its thunders in a grand salute where, but in a few days before, it was dealing death to traitors. The review being ended, all returned thankfully to camp. Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers also watched from his position in line. The line was formed in almost the position occupied by the army of General Lee at the opening of the battle. We had about 250 men in our ranks at this review. Our battle flags were tattered, our clothing worn, and our appearance that of men who had been through the most trying service. Mr. Lincoln has said that he staked the question of publishing his Proclamation of Emancipation upon the result of this battle. Recognizing Antietam as a victory, he had issued his preliminary paper of September 22, 1862, and he now visited the bloody field where, under the gracious favor of God, to whom he had appealed, we had defeated the invasion of the North and made it possible for him to proclaim the purpose of our government to emancipate all slaves in the territory that was in rebellion. Mr. Lincoln was manifestly touched at the worn appearance of our men, and he himself looked serious and careworn. He bowed low in response to the salute of our tattered flags. As I sat upon my horse in front of the regiment, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Lincoln's face, which has remained photographed upon my memory, compared with the small figure of General McClellan, who with jaunty air and somewhat gaudy appearance cantered along beside him. Mr. Lincoln seemed to tower as a giant. The amiable Lincoln, who had officers in stitches laughing into the night the very night before at headquarters, with his mimicry, well-honed stories, and the frantic orchestra of odd sleight of hand and flapping elbows, was subdued from absorbing the grim realities. Reboarding a cramped ambulance with a lifelong sidekick, Ward Layman, Lincoln asked Layman to sing him out of the gloom. Lincoln called for his favorite song, 20 years ago, about a lost love. And he may have involuntarily recalled the beautiful voice of his once 22-year-old fiancée, Anne Rutledge, a hymn which he often asked her to sing before she died of typhoid fever. Vain man, thy fond pursuits forbear. Repent, thine end is nigh. Death at the farthest can't be far. O think before thou die. Thy flesh perhaps thy greatest care shall into dust consume, but destruction stops not there. Sin kills beyond the tomb. His deep recesses had a basement in the twilight beside Anne Rutledge's grave, where Lincoln once said, "Here my heart is buried also." This song, among the most sacred, stayed through time and helped inspire him to give his last full measure of devotion. Layman remembers that 3-mile ride to Bakersville to the north. Mr. Lincoln had said to me, "Layman, sing one of your little sad songs." I knew well what Mr. Lincoln meant by the little sad songs. The sentiment that prompted him to call for such a song had its history, and one of deep and touching interest to me. One little sad song, a simple ballad entitled 20 Years Ago, was above all others his favorite. Many a time in the old days of our familiar friendship on the Illinois circuit, and often at the White House when he and I were alone, have I seen him in tears while I was rendering in my poor way that homely melody. The late Judge David Davis, the Honorable Leonard Swett, and Judge Cora Dunn Beckwith were equally partial to the same ballad. Often have I seen those great men overcome by the peculiar charm they seem to find in the sentiment and melody of that simple song.
I've wandered to the village, Tom. I've sat beneath a tree, upon the schoolhouse playing ground that sheltered you and me. But none were there to greet me, Tom, and few were left to know who played with us upon the grass some 20 years ago. The spring that bubbled 'neath the hill, close by the spreading beach, is very low. 'Twas once so high that we could almost reach. And kneeling down to get a drink, dear Tom, I started so to see how much that I was changed since 20 years ago. Nearby the spring, upon an elm, you know I cut your name. Your sweetheart just beneath it, Tom, and you did mine the same. Some heartless wretch had peeled the bark, 'twas dying sure, but slow, just as she died, whose name you cut some 20 years ago. My lids have long been dry, dear Tom, but tears came to my eyes. I thought of her I loved so well, those early broken ties. I visited the old churchyard and took some flowers to strew upon the graves of those we loved some 20 years ago. Some now are in the churchyard laid, some sleep beneath the sea, but few are left of our own just 20 years ago.
Lincoln and his party eventually arrived at the campsite of General Franklin's 6th Corps near Bakersville. The soldiers in review watched him closely. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, later a great hero of Maine, recalled, "Always after a great battle, and especially disaster, we were sure to see him, slow riding through camp, an outward or inward search in eyes, questioning and answering heart. We could see the deep sadness in his face and feel the burden on his heart, thinking of his great commission to save this people and knowing that he could do this no otherwise than he had been doing. The devotion, the sufferings, and the 1,000 deaths of those into whose eyes his were looking. How he shrunk from the costly sacrifice we could see. And we took him into our hearts with answering sympathy and gave him our pity in return."